Today on Blue 58, the Packers didn't look great in their second preseason game. How concerned should we be?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode. Rough outing Sunday night. I think everybody can agree that the Packers did not look great. So I'll repeat the question again, slightly different way. Should we be concerned about what the Packers went through on Sunday night? My answer is no. However, the however is, I think, a phrase that I come back to a lot at this time of year. Nothing is nothing. Does it really matter that the Packers didn't have a great outing against the Broncos in one preseason game where they didn't play 31 of their top guys? Let's say that. Not their starters, but their top guys. No. Does it matter that they had a rough joint practice with the Broncos on Friday? Not really in a vacuum, no. But does it matter on an individual level that their offensive line depth is struggling, or that there may be some concerns about the defense, or that there may be some concerns about this, that, or the other thing? On an individual level, yeah, I think there are some things there that you can point to and say maybe we should take a second look at this. The backup quarterback situation in particular is something that we're going to talk to today. However, in addition to that, we should remember things change really quickly in the preseason. A week from now, we might be thinking about how the Packers just took it to the Baltimore Ravens and absolutely handled them in their joint practices, came out in their final preseason game. They look so good that they're actually going to petition the NFL to say that we can't actually cut anyone because we just have so many good guys, and it would be an affront to their football talent to release them. What we really need to do is split off the Packers into a second team and have two Green Bay Packers this year. We'll just split the schedule and then we'll combine the results, and that will be how the Packers actually do this year. Exaggerating a little bit here. The point I'm making is that a week and a half ago, we were talking about how everything looked good for the Packers. They come out against the Browns. The starters last three plays because that's all they needed. Jordan Love took care of business. They look great. Now we're talking about real concerns with this team, how quickly that can go. Let's dig into some of the individual stuff. The first, I think, most pressing concern is probably backup quarterback. We're going to save that for its own segment. So take that and put it in the back of your mind. Stick a pin in that. We'll come back to it. The next biggest one is probably the offensive line depth. 2 preseason games in a row now, we've seen the backup offensive line cause some real problems for both the passing game and in the running game. Now, Sean Clifford caused some of his own problems in the passing game when he was taking some pressures that he shouldn't necessarily have taken. He took one real bad sack. But overall, I think the offensive line depth has maybe not looked as good as I thought it would. I think even with that depth looking a little bit suspect, I think when it's all said and done, the Packers are going to still have a pretty solid 1-7, 1-8 or so on the offensive line. Their top 5, you don't have any real concerns there. We've spent a lot of time over the past 2 years now talking about Josh Myers and his role in the Packers offensive line and how protected he should be or things like that. Josh Myers would have been miles ahead of anybody on that offensive line on Sunday and through most of the later stages of last week's game, too, against the Browns. He's probably the guy you have the most concerns about on the offensive line right now, or outside of that, maybe Jordan Morgan, just being that he's a rookie. But if either of those guys were on the second unit during this past game, the entire complexion of that line changes. The Packers, I think, are going to be fine up front. If they ever get in a situation where they're playing their entire second unit offensive line at once, not one preferred starter out there, then you might get in a situation where you worry a little bit. But the second unit offensive line not playing well, I kind of land on who cares there. You talk about the defense. The Packers defense did not play well against the Broncos offense. True, but to just make this point as short as possible, let's be real here. There are a lot of guys playing in the Packers' second and third units who are not going to be in the NFL here in a couple of weeks. Some of them will make the Packers practice squad. Some of them may catch on elsewhere. A lot of them are going to be waiting for a phone call for a while, and for some of them, that phone call is never going to come again. We don't need to spend a whole lot of time worrying about how the second and third units did. Maybe that just means there's not as much depth as we thought after that Browns game, but I don't think it's something worth worrying about. I've seen the storyline as well, worrying about that the fact that the Packers offense may not have played all that well against the Broncos defense in practice. That might be a real one. However, we should also point out that you're not game planning for that the same way that you do against a real opponent. You're not showing everything. You would expect the Packers to look maybe better than they did, and it wasn't great. I'm not saying it was good, but your level of concern there, if the Packers going out and tripping over themselves in week 1 and just getting hammered by the Eagles on the road is a 7 or 8. Not looking good in a joint practice in the second week of the preseason portion of training camp is what? 3? Maybe? I have a hard time really getting all that worked up about it. You can say factually that they didn't do well while still saying, I'm just not all that worried about it either. But the one that came up this week that really kind of made me stop and think here was Matt LaFleur talking about basically the drive and the intensity, the intangibles. A couple quotes here. Quote, certainly I was hoping our guys would come out with more strain, effort, grit after kind of getting humbled the other day in practice, and then to have it happen again is not where you want it to be, end quote. He continued later on, quote, I think it's a good lesson for our guys in terms of it doesn't matter who's out there. If you don't put your best foot forward each and every time you go on that field, these things happen to you. We're going to have to regroup, take a long, hard look in the mirror. We've got to get better. We need that urgency from everybody, end quote. I agree they do need that urgency from everybody. And if you really want to point the finger at somebody, and you may be hearing him do that here, if you need urgency from everybody, the person you may need more of it from is Matt LaFleur. Basically seconds after the Packers beat the Browns in the first week of the preseason, Matt LaFleur was out there saying, yeah, we're not seeing any starters next week. And then the Packers played practically nobody against the Broncos. To me, there's a read on that situation where you're basically putting a big chunk of the team into vacation mode. You're saying to your best and brightest players, like, look, we don't need much from you this week, guys. We're going to do some installs and stuff, but this is basically about the backups. What does that do for the tone of your practices? What does that do? What does that message send to the guys that are further down the roster? How are they supposed to play with urgency and grit and drive and intensity if you're saying to a third of your 90-man roster, no drive, intensity, or grit needed from you this week? And if it was that big of a deal, why do you not have some of those guys out there anyway? If they need to work on their drive and grit and intensity, why not have them on the field working about that? This is, if you've got to complain about Matt LaFleur over his time in Green Bay, sometimes there is a little bit of passivity to him. Sometimes there is some putting a little bit too much of it on the players instead of being the adult in the room and setting the tone yourself. There's a story that I've come back to a few times from 2019, 2020. I think it was 2019 because it was Preston Smith's first year in Green Bay. There's a clip that went around, and I've tried to find it back, but I haven't been able to get it back, of Zadarius Smith coming up to Matt LaFleur early in a practice and saying, look, the guys are a little bit low energy today. Like, can you get us fired up here a little bit, coach? And LaFleur says, you're a leader, you go do it. That cuts both ways. There is some of that where you want your guys like a Zadarius Smith back in 2019. 5 years later, it's a Rashawn Gary or Kenny Clark or Jair Alexander to be the one that lights a fire under your team. If you've ever coached or been in charge of people, that's what you want from your best people. You want them to be able to fire that up. But if you've ever coached or been in charge of people, you know that there are some times where you have to be the tone setter. And Matt LaFleur is not always that guy. There are strengths and weaknesses to every coach, and I would say that is one of the weaknesses to Matt LaFleur's coaching game, is he is not always the tone setter in a way that motivates everybody. You compare his personality to a guy like Dan Campbell in Detroit, who, we've criticized the almost gimmicky sort of confrontational, like in-your-face sort of leadership stuff from him too. But I'd bet you always know where you stand with Dan Campbell, and Dan Campbell is always coming in with his fully caffeinated vibes. He's ready to go. The tone is going to be set by Dan Campbell. Matt LaFleur is not always that way. Now, I did mention that backup quarterback might be a real concern here. I wrote about this for Acme Packing Company this week. basically approaching this for a couple different angles. Check it out on the site, agripackingcompany.com. If I haven't mentioned it on here recently, I do write for them as well, in addition to working for the Power Sweep in this deal. Working for the Power Sweep, it's my thing, so that's who I work for, is me. But I wrote about it this week, approaching it from a couple different angles. First, questions the Packers need to answer about Sean Clifford and Michael Pratt that I kind of think that they've got the answer to already. First, could either of those guys get you out of a game where you're either leading or keep you competitive in a game where you're trailing? Think of Jordan Love coming in for Aaron Rodgers against the Eagles in 2022. Or if you want a much more dated example, and it pains me to think about how dated this example is getting to be, Aaron Rodgers coming in against the Dallas Cowboys in 2007 when Brett Favre gets hurt. The Packers didn't win either of those games, but they also didn't fall completely to pieces and were competitive down the stretch against both the Cowboys and the Eagles. Knowing what you know about Sean Clifford and Michael Pratt, do you think either of them could do that for the Packers right now? Could they get the Packers through the rest of a game if Jordan Love went down? I think the answer is probably no right now. Zooming out a little bit further, if Jordan Love had, say, a non-season ending injury and he's going to be out for a month, could either Sean Clifford or Michael Pratt get the Packers to, say, 2-2 just to keep the season afloat while Jordan Love comes back from, I don't know, a severely sprained ankle or a shoulder injury that does not require surgery, but he has to sit for a while? Something like that. Pick your injury, I don't know what it would be. I think the answer there is no, too. And those, I think, are the real backup quarterback scenarios. The one where the kind of pie-in-the-sky situation where almost sports movie-esque, your starting quarterback goes down and your backup comes in and saves the season and leads you to the championship game and everybody, they win and you get the girl in the end. That really does not exist. That's just the difference between a starting quarterback and your backup quarterback. The skill level, the ability level is just not there. But getting you out of those situations and keeping your season afloat, that's what a backup quarterback is for. I don't think Sean Clifford or Michael Pratt is that for the Packers right now. But the point of the piece is this: the Packers need to keep swinging. We need to keep dumping resources into this problem, into this question, and see what else is out there. It always comes up. We talk about it. We've talked about it here before with Ron Wolf drafting quarterbacks all the time, wanting to continue to invest in that position, and Brian Gutekunst wanting to essentially continue that legacy. He's spoken on record a couple times about wanting to invest in the quarterback position like that. The real process to that is to just keep dumping resources into quarterbacks. You talk about Ron Wolf drafting Mark Brunell and Matt Hasselbeck and Aaron Brooks and even maybe Ty Detmer to a lesser extent. That's true, but there were a whole bunch of other guys that he drafted that didn't work out. There's at least 3 of them that never played a game in the NFL. And on top of that, he was signing guys all the time too. Jim McMahon, TJ Rubley, Steve Bono, Doug Peterson, Rick Mirer, however you say his last name, Mirer. Never knew that. Grew up reading about that name. Never figured that one out. In addition to, trading for Brett Favre, just constantly throwing resources at the quarterback position, knowing that most of them aren't going to work out. Of those guys that he signed as backups, McMahon, Peterson, Rubley, Bono, guys like that, most of them were not great NFL quarterbacks. With respect to the 2-time Super Bowl ring haver Doug Peterson, one with the Packers, one with the Eagles, not a great thrower of the football, not a real presence. Even when the Eagles tried to make him one with Andy Reid as their starter there for 1 year, he was not much of a quarterback. Relative to the population, of course he was, but relative to NFL quarterbacks, just not much there. But guys like Brunell and Hasselbeck and even Aaron Brooks ended up being quite good. But to get to those guys, you had to dump a lot of resources into the position. So the Packers are pretty early into this process. If you look at Jordan Love, kind of separate from that was the succession plan from Aaron Rodgers. If you're in the post-Love era, or not the post-Rodgers era, the Love era now, if you're trying to invest in guys that are going to be behind him, we're not that far into it. You haven't done that much to really bring guys aboard here. They tried to sign Alex Magoo. That was a worthy attempt. Ended up at receiver and then out of the NFL. They drafted Michael Pratt. They drafted Sean Clifford. Neither of those guys looks like they're going to pan out. We're early in the investment process, though, and Gutekunst has to keep dumping resources in this until he figures out a guy for the Packers, maybe multiple guys if he ends up being a longtime GM like Ron Wolf was, and there's really no reason to think that he won't at this point. But there's a long way to go before the Packers get to that Ron Wolf stage of success here, and the only way that you get there is continuing to dump resources into it. Justice Mosqueda of Acme Packing Company put together a pretty comprehensive list of guys the Packers might want to look into for the short term. It's a great start, but there's a long way to go if you want depth beyond that and into the future, and it's a worthy endeavor because it's such an important position. So you just got to keep investing, got to keep figuring that out, because I don't think either Clifford or Pratt is going to be the answer for right now. I had a question a while back about somebody that we really haven't talked about a whole lot in this preseason that I want to take a second and dive into. Just as an aside, I was talking with somebody the other day about how this seems like the most boring preseason that I can remember. Training camp just has not had a lot of storylines where the Packers, you don't know what they're going to do, and there's not a lot of position battles and stuff like that. And the preseason games have been kind of duds outside of the early stuff with Jordan Love in preseason game number 1. That, first of all, is a really good thing. But second of all, puts us in an interesting situation as as people reacting to the Packers and talking about the Packers, whereas there's not much to talk about. So for my part, I've tried to explore this preseason as a situation where we can talk about things that are going to affect the team, kind of in a bigger picture sort of thing, and that's a unique way to approach this as we go into the season, just trying to figure out the little nuances of this roster. And this next question, I think, is a good example of that. I apologize because I lost the name of the person who wanted me to talk about this person, but they are in our Discord server. So if this was you, give me a shout in there, and I'll make sure that we mention you in the next episode. If you'd like to become one of those people that hangs out in our Discord server, hit up the patreon.com/thepowersweep or support us via Substack at thepowersweep.substack.com. And that's one of the benefits that you get through supporting either of those areas for any dollar amount that you choose, except for Substack. You can't pick the amount that you choose there. That's just one of the quirks of that system. But anyway, we were talking about Brenton Cox in our Discord server because he's kind of been at the periphery of the Packers' edge position here for a couple of years now, and I thought it was worth doing a quick refresher on him. So as background, Cox, now a second-year edge rusher with the Packers, originally an Ohio State commit, but ended up at Georgia instead after reopening his recruiting after being a verbal commit to OSU, was dismissed after 1 year from the program, transferred to Florida, sat out a year because of the redshirt rules at the time, and while he was out, he had a marijuana possession arrest in 2019. I don't mention this as a value judgment one way or another on him or the crime for which he was arrested. Just it's part of the story here because the story of Brenton Cox's college career is kind of twofold. The one hand, he had a lot of problems with a couple different programs, the second of which was Florida, which dismissed him midway through the 2022 season. He still hung around, graduated, got his degree in exercise science. I think it was. I may have written that down incorrectly, but did get his college degree from Florida after being dismissed from the football program. That, I think, is a point worth mentioning in the character discussion on Brenton Cox. Yes, he did get booted from a couple programs here, but when he had an opportunity to flee those circumstances, or at least one of those circumstances, he didn't. He stuck around and graduated from Florida. Heading into the 2023 NFL Draft, he was Dane Brugler's number 39 edge rusher in the class. Classic character concern guy, also dragged down a little bit by unimpressive testing. Not bad per se, but just a 6.52 relative athletic score. Also happens to be a little bit on the smaller side, too. Listed at 6'4", in actuality just a little bit shorter than that, just 250 pounds, is not what anybody would call a particularly big edge rusher. However, was fairly productive both at Georgia and at Florida. A career production ratio over 1 is very good for an undrafted free agent. He had 34 tackles for loss and 15.5 sacks in 46 college games. That's good for a production ratio of 1.07. Wouldn't be a tier 1 prospect in our edge rusher metrics, but worth mentioning just for those numbers, especially in the undrafted free agent pool. And to his credit, and we should mention this after a lot of the, at times I would say, borderline concern trolling about character questions that you get from some of these guys. You haven't heard a word about him negatively in Green Bay to this point, or at least I haven't. He's been a model citizen in Green Bay. Sometimes it just takes guys a while to mature, and college coaches are not the most understanding people in the world sometimes. It's very much, especially when you're a successful college coach, my way or the highway. And, Cox took the highway a couple times, but has no reason to complain about him in Green Bay whatsoever so far. Last year in the preseason, 87 snaps on defense, all end stuff, never kicked inside, all edge rusher, some defensive end, but was always lined up on the outside. Finished the preseason with 3 tackles, 1 for loss, 1 quarterback hit as well. Also played 12 snaps on special teams, has not been a big special teams guy, and more on that in a second. But has not played a ton of snaps on special teams. He did make the initial 53-man roster last year as an undrafted free agent. As an aside on that, I think Ryan Wood of the Green Bay Press-Gazette and PackersNews.com is right on. I think the undrafted free agent streak is over. I don't think there's going to be one that makes the initial 53-man roster this year. They didn't sign hardly any this year. And unless something really unusual changes over the next week or so, I don't think there's going to be an undrafted free agent rookie on the roster this year. Of course, a guy like Emmanuel Wilson has a real good shot of making the roster, but he's technically a veteran now, I would suppose. Anyway, undrafted free agent last year, made the 53 as a rookie, appeared in 4 games, just played 4 snaps on defense, though 9 on special teams, was not a big contributor. So far this preseason, he's played 50 snaps on defense so far, 11 on special teams, and has lined up exclusively as a defensive end on the left side. 4 tackles, 1 sack, 1 tackle for loss, 1 quarterback hit so far this year. In terms of outlook for Brenton Cox, tough outlook ahead, but probably the easiest path to the roster of the non-starters or draft pick at his position. The depth chart makes it for pretty tough sledding ahead of him. There's really no two ways about it. Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, Lucas Van Ness are absolute locks for the roster. They are going to make the roster, 100% guaranteed no matter what. J.J. Enagbare right there too. If there's a vulnerable person among those 4, it's him, but he's not going to lose a 53-man spot unless, I don't know, something really unexpected happens. He slaps Matt LaFleur in a meeting or something. I don't know. It's really going to come down to just how many edges they keep. If it's 5, I think Cox is going to be a lock. So the special team stuff does not bother me. It's not a big priority, I think, to Rich Bisaccia to keep guys with his body type on the roster for special teams purposes. He's been more safeties and tight ends and defensive backs, and I think that's going to be even more important as things change with the kickoff coverage and blocking units. Just doesn't bother me a whole lot that Brenton Cox does not play special teams. If the Packers keep 5 edge rushers, I think he's in. If they don't, he'd be the first to go. But if it's 5, I think he's in. I don't think there's a real competitor to him. Some of the other guys around last year played more special teams. I just don't think that's that big of a concern for the Packers, and I think it's going to lead to Brenton Cox getting a roster spot. But there is your Brenton Cox refresher. Now, the one storyline that we haven't talked about so far in this episode is the Packers, well, what do you call it? The kicker situation. I was going to say kicker saga. Sagas have interesting things in them. This has not been overly interesting. It's just been mostly sad and a little bit frustrating. The Packers can't get their kicker situation figured out yet. It is not figured out. But the question again popped up in our Discord server, and again, I neglected to write down whoever's name this was. How do you find a good kicker? How are these teams that have good kickers getting their good kickers? Well, I'm happy you asked, because I looked into it, and I still don't know. Well, that's not entirely true. I do know, but the answer is not going to be super pleasing to people who are worried about the Packers' kicking situation. My idea was that I was going to look over the last 5 years of essentially data here at kickers who had graded at least an 80 on Pro Football Focus's kicker metrics, and see how those guys ended up with the teams that they were on when they put up those grades. But after just 1 year of looking at the data, 2023, it seemed that the answer was so clear that I didn't bother looking back at any other sort of metrics. So how did the guys that are good kickers end up on the teams that they were on? The vast majority just signed as free agents. That's really it. And the vast majority of those guys played with many, many other teams before they ended up with the with the teams that they're on. That's really the size of it. Unless you're drafting a guy that turns out to be good right away, or signing one from another guy's practice squad, chances are you're going to be signing a reject and hoping for the best. Before we dive into the exact number, one thought as to why that is. Kicking is a high variance thing in the NFL. People, I think, like to characterize it as this thing that is consistent, or that you can master or be good at for a long time. I think that is true to an extent, but I think it's a lot closer to being like a really good closer or relief pitcher in baseball. Just because you're a good closer now doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good closer in the future, or even that you were necessarily a good closer in the past. You just got the job right now because the team needed somebody to do the job, and you're doing it because you're doing it well right now. But as soon as you falter, they're going to replace you with somebody else, and then you're going to go on to another team and then either be bad or good with them, and it'll have nothing to do with your previous performance. It's just a really, really variable thing that has a lot of variables that go into it, and then a weird psychological twist to it as well. Just imagine the pressure that goes into being an NFL kicker. If you've ever stood on a field in a big sports stadium, even if it's empty, it feels like there's a lot of people looking at you. Now imagine that same situation with 80,000 people screaming at you as loud as they can, and then you've got to do something that is athletically difficult. You have one chance to get it right, and there's a bunch of stuff going on that is completely out of your control. Is the wind going to gust randomly? Is your cleat going to hold in the ground? Is the snap going to come on time and on target? Is the holder going to get the ball down? You can start to see why kickers start out a little bit crazy and then might go a little bit crazy. You can see why guys might be good at it for a while, and then they might go into a funk and not be good at it ever again. Or they might go into a low period in their career and then rediscover it again later. I totally understand why kickers would struggle. It's frustrating when you see your guy going through it. We lived through a couple of those dips with Mason Crosby over the years. But man, do I ever get it. Anyway, my research revealed that in 2023 there were 14 kickers in the NFL that graded at least an 80 by Pro Football Focus. I don't care what that grade is measuring. I don't care if that's a good grade or a bad grade. I had to pick something, though, so that's what I went with. I just figured 80 was a good place to go. That did cut off a couple of actually pretty good kickers, too. Daniel Carlson, for a Packers connection because of his brother being one at least. But this seems like a pretty good sample here. 14 kickers graded at least an 80. 11 of those 14 signed with the team that they were on in 2023 as a free agent. Another one signed as an undrafted free agent, has just been with that team since then. That was Justin Tucker, who signed with the Ravens as an undrafted free agent in 2012. And 2 other guys were drafted. Of those 14 players, just 4 of them are with the original team that acquired them. And one of those 4 comes with an asterisk. The 4 are Brandon Aubrey from the Dallas Cowboys, Evan McPherson from the Cincinnati Bengals, Justin Tucker from the Baltimore Ravens, and Jason Sanders from the Miami Dolphins. Aubrey gets a little bit of an asterisk there because he was a professional or borderline professional soccer player for a while before he decided he'd try to kick field goals instead. Played in the USFL and then signed with the Cowboys after a stint in the USFL. The others, McPherson, Tucker, and Sanders, were all either drafted or signed as undrafted free agents after the draft. So McPherson was drafted in 2021 by the Bengals, I think a 5th-round pick. I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter. And then Sanders was a 7th-round pick by the Dolphins in 2018. All of the rest of them, signed with signed with their teams as free agents. 2 of them signed from other teams as where they were members of their practice squad. So Jake Elliott of the Eagles and Harrison Butker of the Chiefs signed from the Bengals and Panthers practice squads, respectively, to the Eagles and Chiefs. But a bunch of the others were with a bunch of other NFL teams first. Chase McLaughlin had 10 other stints with NFL teams, not 10 different NFL teams, but 10 other stints with the NFL teams before he signed with the Buccaneers. Cameron Dicker had stints with 3 other NFL teams before landing with the Chargers. Greg Zuerlein had spent time with 2 other teams before landing with the Jets. Chris Boswell played for 2 other teams before he was with the Steelers. Matt Prater had 6 other stints with NFL teams, a couple different stints with a couple different teams among them before ending up with the Cardinals. It goes on and on and on and on. The Packers are not in a unique situation here of trying a bunch of different guys at kicker. So the answer to the question, how do you find a good kicker, is very similar, I think, to the Packers quarterback situation or backup quarterback situation. How do the Packers find a good one? How do they get some stability here in their kicker situation? You just got to keep trying. And I think they're probably going about it the right way. They tried drafting one guy. It has not solidified their kicker situation. That was Anders Carlson. They signed Greg Joseph, who's been with a couple other NFL teams. He has not grabbed the opportunity either. And behind those 2 preferred guys, they've cycled through at least 3 other guys so far this year, the calendar year of 2024. And I suspect we're going to be riding this ride for a while. But based on the evidence, based on what it takes to get good kickers and how other teams in the NFL have gotten their good kickers, the Packers are walking the right path here. They're doing the right thing. You just got to keep dumping resources and taking shots on guys until you find somebody that sticks. Chances are it's going to take a while. And there's a pretty good chance that a guy that you sign and then reject because he's not getting the job done actually goes on to be a pretty decent kicker somewhere else. That's just the way that things work out. You just got to hope that you try enough guys and land on a good one in the midst of his kind of high period as a kicker, because that's really what kicking comes down to. There are going to be guys that go through highs and lows, and you got to ride the highs while you have them and hope that the lows don't last too long. But that's really what it comes down to with kickers in the NFL. And the Packers are kind of mired in a bunch of lows simultaneously right now, but that's the process you have to go through. And eventually the odds suggest that you have to land on somebody that's pretty good, and hopefully that's sooner rather than later for the Packers. So I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with somebody you think would enjoy it. That's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.